Okay, so we've got a good panel formed here. This is a little different than what was originally planned. Dr. Burgraff couldn't be here because his wife is ill. Dr. Kasten teaches during this time, so I kind of knew, and I'd forgotten that Dr. Lewis is teaching during this time as well. So we don't have the two of them, unfortunately. But you all know, of course, Dr. Kreider and Dr. Lott. Sitting here between them is Laramie Minga, one of our PhD students, who serves at Woodlawn Baptist Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. How long have you been there?
It'll be 10 years in March.
Okay, good. So he is here this week taking his PhD qualifying exam. So he had one 3-hour exam on Monday, one 3-hour exam on Tuesday. Today is his day off. Tomorrow he'll have another 3-hour exam, and then Friday he'll have another 3-hour exam. So you can be praying for him. But we thought that he would be a good addition to the panel today as well. So all four of us obviously have one foot in academia, in seminary education, and one foot in the church. And I think that's kind of where we all are living right now. And so we're gonna some of the questions have to do with strictly with ministry. Some of the questions have to do with academics, and we'll kind of to bridge both of those subjects. And again, jump in at any time. We want this to be as helpful for all of us as possible. I want to begin with just go through each of us and just briefly talk about our call to ministry. I think probably all of us could spend 20, 30 minutes talking about our journey to this point. So just really brief the highlights. How were you called to ministry, and what sort of brought you to this point? I want to actually start with Dr. Lott, because I think you, in some ways, you're the most interesting because you think about music history.
We know that.
Yeah, we know that. Right.
Don't set their expectations.
Yeah. Well, I mean that to mean, music history is your field. You don't immediately think music history seminary, right? So
yeah, I did.
So I'm interested to hear what led you to music history first of all, and then why have you chosen to spend the entirety of your career teaching music history in a theological seminary?
Okay. Well, I may go back even farther than that. I mean, in a way, I never felt like I had a specific call to ministry. I've been involved in church music almost since I can remember. I grew up in a small church and was playing piano by second grade, and there were people in the church who encouraged the young people to get involved, and so I was not only encouraged but basically required to play piano on Sunday night at like 5th or 6th grade, and then I graduated to Sunday morning. So I was always involved, always interested in church music, and of course I continue to play piano in church now. I've been at Gamble Street for 9 years. So that's always been a part of my life. It never occurred to me that I would do something sort of full-time in church music. I got my bachelor's degree in piano, then I realized I really wasn't a performer, and then I got very interested in music history, even though my music history teacher was not, he was really boring, but I loved the material anyway. And then I didn't really, because the school I went to, I didn't really even think about seminary, but one of my best friends growing up was Randy Edwards. You might know through Youth Q. His older brother Mark, who was at First Nashville forever, we were family dinner with their family. He said, "Have you ever thought about teaching the seminary?" I was like, "No." I said, "Well, you ought to." And I was like, "Okay." But then 6 years later, I find there's an opening. Of course, at that time, they did not advertise. You had to know someone who knew someone who knew someone. But one of the faculty knew me directly, so that's how I ended up here. And I used to say my call to ministry was when Dean McKinney called me on the telephone to say, "We'd like for you to come teach," and he sounded like the voice of God. And it's like, yes, I'll be there. So, and at first, my first response was, well, just call me to Africa and be a missionary there as to go to, but I didn't know that much about the seminary, really, and then I realized what kind of program they had, and it's been such a perfect fit. I can't imagine being anywhere else, and being able to, combine my interests and love for church music with my academic background. That's really been wonderful.
Great.
Very cool.
it's rare to have somebody spend their entire career in one institution.
Yes, it is.
Well, so many people have asked me to go elsewhere. Been a struggle.
You need some incentive.
Yeah, there you go.
It really
Well,
is.
I tell students, I'm like, you only need one. You only need one job. You don't need. Doesn't need to be 30 openings, just one, and that's all there's ever been
Yeah.
for me. But
God moves in mysterious ways to lead us to where He wants
Yeah.
us.
That's right.
Larry, what about you? What was your path?
Well, I grew up in choral music and instrumental music and band through middle school and high school, and so I excelled there, and so really had a desire to go into music somehow, and so I ended up going to Ole Miss and studying music education with the hopes of going into some kind of choral music field. But in the midst of going to Ole Miss, I started serving a small church in the country, just 60, 70 folks, and through that just got a desire to maximize my gifts and skills in use for the Lord and His church. And it seemed the best way to do that was full-time pastoral music ministry. And so I pursued that, and I actually ended up transferring from Ole Miss after 3 years there, did all music there, and then transferred to Level College of New Orleans Baptist Seminary, finished my undergrad there, stayed and did my master's in church music. And then I landed here because I was really, my education was really saturated in music, and there was theology along the way, of course, in seminary, but I wanted to balance it out with some rigorous theology and philosophy, and Southwestern was the place for me to accomplish that. And I've been in my church, as we said earlier, for 10 years. I started there the year I graduated from New Orleans, and so it'll be 10 years in March.
The unique thing about Laramie's situation is that he was in his church, and then you had a pastoral transition, and you stayed on, which is sometimes rare, right? Is that how it happened?
No, there have been transitions
Okay.
as staff have left and come over the years. When I came to Woodlawn, we had 5 full-time staff. Now we have 3.5 staff.
Yeah.
And so as people have left, and we've shared some responsibilities, so I'm actually over discipleship and worship now. Where I first came on is
Just worship.
yeah.
Great. Good. Dr. Kreider,
So
how did you get from trombone?
Yeah,
to
trombone.
worship?
Exactly. I was believe it or not, I was a high school band director for several years in Ohio, but I kept playing my horn a lot. Ended up doing a master's degree in performance, and then just decided, you know what, I love doing this. I love playing. I love teaching. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to go do my doctorate in performance and pedagogy. But while I was in Greeley, Colorado, Amy and I got involved in a church, and we just went to the church. It was close to our apartment; we could walk to it. And the pastor started discipling me, and the pastor's wife started discipling Amy. And then I started doing some arrangements for some instrumental groups at the church, and then I started bringing some guys from campus to play, and a couple of them got saved, and it was just kind of a crazy time. And then the music minister, the minister of music, decided to leave. Pastor Jack, who was mentoring me, said, "Would you do this?" And I thought, I have no theological training. I have no training. I'm a musician. There was just no. I thought I'm. And he looked at me and he said, "Joe, God doesn't call the qualified; He qualifies the called." And that was kind of a pithy little statement, but I somehow couldn't get rid of it. Long story short, I did end up doing that and absolutely loved it. And so I'm working on a doctorate at this time, and then feeling this tug toward ministry, and kind of shoved that out. Went to Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. Continued to do director of instrumental studies, but ended up at Calvary Baptist Church in Santa Barbara, California, and absolutely loved it, and was formed and shaped by the people there. But kept pushing it away, and then ended up at Southwest Baptist University. And while I was there, an interim at Second Baptist Church in Springfield came open. And while I was there, Dr. Roy Fish from Southwestern Seminary was the interim at the same time for 18 months. And at the end of the 18 months, Roy Fish from this institution looks at me and he says, "Have you ever thought about full-time ministry?" And I thought, Dr. Fish, I'm a musician. I'm trained a musician. He said, no, you really need to think about it. He said, it would not surprise me if God's calling you into that. And Dr. John Marshall, who was the pastor that came after Dr. Fish, had a long conversation. He said, would you be willing to leave academia? And Amy and I prayed through it, and God did some amazing things that I don't have time to go into now, but amazing things to absolutely say it's not. So when we left, it was 14 years full-time ministry in the local church, thinking I would never ever go back into academia. And then God called us to Liberty and then to Southern, and beyond my wildest dreams, never thought that I would end up where Dr. Fish was. But so it was the Lord, for me, the way I would say this is, at every single church, the Lord was just, it was very gentle. It was more like, do this interim, because I know you won't be obedient enough to do it full time initially, right? But it was just gracious, the gracious way that He's done that.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. So your journey is from academia to the church, and now a combination.
Yes.
Mine is sort of reverse. I grew up in a family in a church with a heavy emphasis on music. I've got two sisters. All three of us had three private lessons each growing up. So we had a lot of music going on in the home. So I had a lot of emphasis on music for a long time. In high school, I really developed a interest and love for theology and philosophy. I wrote my first music philosophy paper in 10th grade and just loved it. I mean, it was so much fun.
Somehow that does not surprise me.
Oh, it's third grade.
And I've been writing ever since.
Yes, you have.
So I always knew sort of in my high school years and leading my senior year that I wanted to combine the two, music and theology, philosophy together. So I did a church music undergraduate degree, went straight into full-time church ministry in Illinois, but then pursued a master's degree in musicology at the same time, with an emphasis in aesthetics. So again, mixing the two, and then just a lot of turns and changes. Ended up coming here for the PhD, intending just to spend a couple of years here, and leaving and going into ministry. I've always loved teaching, but that wasn't necessarily the intended goal. I was doing a lot of speaking in churches. I'd already written my first book, so I plan to kind of continue that, get the PhD, and then just continue trying to help churches and speak in churches. But then after the first year of being here, they asked me to teach adjunct, and then hired me on faculty the second year, and I've been here ever since. So it was another. I think in each one of our journeys, it was not what we expected, and the Lord does mysterious things. So
I'm praying that you're an Alan Lott and you will be here for your entire career. That is my prayer.
Yeah.
What's interesting in all the calls is it's not like this whispering voice in our ear from the Lord, but it's a desire that we had, and then there's this confirmation of others in our own lives that led us that way. And so sometimes I think we have this mysterious view of calling when it's really our desires and the confirmation of others, and even gifting and skills to a degree, whether they come before or after.
That's a great point. And the necessity of preparation, right?
Right.
I mean, you might not have it at the beginning, but sometimes we have an idea of a calling that, well, I'm called. I gotta get out there and not waste time in preparation. But no, preparation is part of the call.
Yes.
And that's why this kind of education is so critical. So
absolutely.
Important. That's
That's
great.
good.
So here's another question that was asked by somebody. I didn't have people put names on anything. How important are relationships in local church ministry and even academics? The specific question that was asked was between the music minister and the senior pastor. How important is that relationship? How do you foster that relationship? But let's just expand it to all sorts of relationships. Other staff members, relationships with people in the church, relationships with your wife. One of the questions was, what if you believe you're called to a particular ministry, but your wife is not so convinced? How do you deal with that? So let's open it up to any thoughts about the importance of relationships in ministry. And the seminary is not a church, but there's a lot of similarities between how things happen here in a church. How important are relationships, and how do we foster good relationships within the context of ministry and academia?
Well, I think relationships are pretty foundational. I mean, for one, our entire ministry is built on a relationship of between us and God, and then that relationship also expands to between the people, which is the body of Christ, is relationship as well, and that is reconciled, is brought together with one another. And so certainly relationships are incredibly important and foundational. That as far as the context of the local church, there may be no greater relationship than that of the preaching pastor and that of the music or worship pastor, whatever that title might be, because those guys are the primary leaders of the church that as far as their formation goes, because there is no more formational time in the life of the church than that of the gathered service. And so your men who are leading that they need to have a great relationship as well. And as far as husbands and wives, we see in qualifications for elders and pastors that the relationship between a husband and wife is extremely important in recognizing that call and whether or not you're qualified. And so, relationships are very important.
What are some ways to foster the kind of relationship that's necessary between the worship pastor and the senior pastor? Does that happen naturally? Does it happen without work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And here's the thing in any relationship, right? Relationships need to be intentionally fostered. They don't grow. Sometimes we see relationships that grow organically, and they just, we just always have gotten along. We're just good friends. But all relationships take intentionality, and I think that if what I would say to seminary students is, if relational connectivity with other people is a struggle or has somewhat of a roadblock, really dive into knowing how to develop relationships while you're here, because the church needs it and the church expects it of their pastors. Relational connectivity, and so I think it's really, really important to develop those relational skills if you feel like that's not something that is naturally happens for you, and that really that's such a huge aspect, because the ministry of the people, right? The ministry is not just the music. It's just not your theological understanding. The ministry is the people, and that always has to be so clearly realized in our heads. As far as the pastor goes, I think there's got to be an understanding of this is the way we connect the best, and that may be playing golf once a week, or that might be and I think it can look different in so many different ways. But I think just a relational respect and a relational comfortability and a relational trust, those are the things that need to happen. I don't need to play golf every week with somebody that I trust and that there's a mutual respect there, and that we can work together closely and effectively. In other words, they don't need to be absolutely my best friend, but that trust and respect are huge.
Yeah. That's good. You've got to intentionally do things outside of just the formal meetings of the staff.
That's correct.
Otherwise, that kind of relationship doesn't happen.
Yes.
And this is, we had this panel last semester on finding a ministry position, what kinds of questions to ask of a potential ministry. I think this is one thing to be on the lookout for. Is the senior pastor of the church that you're considering, does he seem like someone who's going to be open to this, fostering it? And this is a question to ask. If I come here, what kinds of things will you and I do to foster our relationship and our communication one with another? And frankly, if you get a sense that he has no interest in that, he's going to lock himself in his study and just wants you to do your job, that's a little bit of a red flag.
That's
because
right.
then there's potentials for problem. There's got to be that communication. Dr. Lott, you're many years here on the side of just a seminary, an academic institution. How important has it been for the faculty to have relationships with one another? What have you seen in your years here?
Well, it's one of my favorite things about the job, or my colleagues, and I love them all. well, one or two maybe over the years. But in general, I mean, I can't wait to have lunch in the lunchroom or go out to eat or just talk in the hall. And of course, so many decisions you have to make. You know, we're constantly making important decisions, and the fact that we do trust each other and respect each other's opinions, and you know, has been really an amazing place. And it's not the way it is at a lot of music schools.
Right.
You may have been to a music school where the voice faculty didn't speak to each other, and piano teachers were all rivals, and their students became rivals of each other.
Right.
But it's almost like I really haven't had to work at it here, so I don't really have good advice on how to make it work. But I just know that it's wonderful when it does. It makes
And yet
everything so
you
much
mentioned
easier.
some things that we do. I mean, you know, we go to the lunchroom and we hang out together and we have conversations, and you know, it would be tempted to. We're so busy, we don't have time to do
Right,
those sorts
yeah.
of things. But that's the kind of thing that has nurtured those relationships.
So we are more
Yeah.
than just professional colleagues.
Right. That's one thing that struck me immediately when I came on as faculty. I was very much, most of the rest of the faculty here had been here for a long time. I was like the newbie, and it struck me right away. I mean, hearing conversations about your kids growing up together and running around the halls of Cowden Hall and knowing one another, I knew right away that there was something special about the relationships. Yeah, that's good. So let's shift gears a little bit. Somebody asked about dissertations and PhD work. So I know, you know, several of you probably are thinking about the possibility of that. Maybe you're not, but you should be. I just mentioned in my Psalms class yesterday that there needs to be people who write on the Psalms, and maybe that's some of you. So and then we've got doctoral students watching as well. So a question was asked about what it's like to write a dissertation. 3 of us have written a dissertation. 1 of us is soon to be writing a dissertation, has worked towards that end. But the question is specifically asked as master's students who maybe have an inkling that this is in their future. What should they be already thinking about in terms of writing, research interests? Is there anything that they can do even now to prepare them for potential work in the future in doctoral studies? Any thoughts on that?
So real quickly, and this is interesting. Pastor Laramie and I had a conversation in my office yesterday, and probably 50% of it was what?
It was on research, dissertation research.
Exactly. So when you head into that area, anybody around you, the first thing they're going to ask you is, "What's your topic? What are you thinking about? What's your area?" And it's because you realize there are big holes. Scott, help me with this, and Dr. Lott as well. Think about worship programs in the United States being relatively young compared to other areas. There are huge holes in research. Dr. Annual mentioned it yesterday in his Psalms class, the area of the Psalms. So I'm thinking through with Laramie, just tell me what you're looking at, because there are holes in research that we need to have people write in. And so even now is not too early for any of you to be thinking, wow, there's not a lot of literature, there's not a lot of research on this particular area. When I went to do this paper for this class or this, I didn't see very much of anything here. Dr. Lott, would you say that's a...
Oh, yeah, well, the other thing I would say, just as you're reading, you know, sometimes there's a little brief reference about, something else, and it's like, well, maybe that whole little footnote might be a topic for you. The other thing is, just as you're reading books and articles, find ones that you really like, that meant something to you. It's like, how did they go about this? What makes this so appealing to me, and could I maybe do that same thing, but with a different topic, a different person, a different period of time? I mean, I didn't think I would ever write a book like the Brahms book, but it's like, that's exactly the kind of work that I've admired in other people. I thought it'd be wonderful if I could do that someday. And I didn't really start off trying to do that, but you know, transferring, you know, the methodology or the approach to just a different topic. because it's good to have models and have models of writing that you admire, and then models of writing that you don't like. Sometimes negative examples are much more helpful because it's easier to see
Don't do that.
what's wrong about it. Sometimes when something is wonderful, it's so perfect you can't quite figure out how it all goes together. But both negative and positive role models can be helpful.
Yeah, there are two pieces of advice here that I think are really, really helpful. Number one, it's not too soon to start compiling a list of topics.
That's right.
I mean, I started a list in 4th grade. No, just kidding.
I don't do that.
Yeah, but honestly, during my master's work, for sure, I started a list of topics that I thought might someday turn into something. And so when I started my doctoral work, I had a list, and I kept adding to that. And by the end of the first semester into the second semester, I had a more narrowed focus. But I encourage our doctoral students, for sure, have at least a general area right at the beginning.
Yes.
I've seen doctoral students who don't do that until the very end. So they get through all their coursework, they get through their qualifying exams, and then they go, I wonder what I should write about. And then that's a long time then before they can even get to the point of writing a dissertation. So I encourage our students, have something at the beginning, and then as much as possible, write papers in the doctoral program that will contribute to your dissertation. And that includes for master's work. If you have any inkling of going this direction, use papers in the courses that you're taking, whether in theology school or our school, and explore some areas. You might think, hey, this is an area that might interest me or that I think might be worth exploring. Nothing is better for figuring out if this is a good topic than researching and writing in that area. You might get to the end and go, nope, didn't really like that, but at least you've ruled something out. So that if you're thinking about that, I would encourage you to do that. And then the other piece of advice is this idea of modeling. You get a lot of reading, right, in your classes. Sometimes you're reading along and you probably think, this is really boring and obtuse. I have no clue what this author is saying, right? Stop for a moment and ask the question, why? Mm-hmm. What is bad about this writing? You can learn from that, right? Or you might read something and be like, man, this author is so clear in his communication. I mean, this book by Aniel is the best thing I've ever read. But there's another example. Don't just pay attention to the content. Pay attention to the way the author is writing, and you might be able to glean some things there. That's really, really good. Okay, another question here is about just sort of the current status of music in evangelical and SBC life. The specific question is, how do you recruit music majors in a system that has de-emphasized the liberal arts, in high school and even in college? So we're facing this as a seminary, right? How do you recruit students like that? But we could even go broadly. How do we deal with the current status culturally and in the church, where there's sort of a de-emphasis on musical excellence? And how do we communicate a need for that and then recruit others and try to convince them, hey, if you want to serve in a church, you need biblical fidelity, musical excellence, and a ministry mindset. How do we do that? How do we convince others of that need?
Well, one of the challenges is a lot of folks who want to go to the seminary to do music have a mindset that might not necessarily be what's best for a local church, and then they have to get to the seminary, and the seminary is going to teach them what they believe is best. We would hope that they would do that. And so the problem is there is this disconnect, and so you've got to bring them along somehow at the same time, meeting them somewhere so that you can bring them along. Now, I've not actually served in a seminary setting, but in my own local church, what I did is I identified a student who was, I guess he was 15 or 16 at the time, that I thought that he was, heading down a path where I thought he had the giftings and the desire, and I saw him being really thoughtful in his approach to worship and music. And so I just started investing in that 15-year-old and leading him along the way, and brought him on as an intern for a few summers. And I'm actually in a 6-week sabbatical at church right now, and he's the one leading for me as I'm gone these 6 weeks. And now he's a freshman at LSU and studying music with hopes to go into seminary afterwards. And so he gets it. He, even as an 18-year-old, he knows what he might be 17. He graduated a year early, but even as a young man, he already knows what he should be looking for as far as education, so that he might best serve the local church. And so he's not the typical, hey, I can play the guitar, I'm a great looking guy and can sing well, but knows nothing. He's not that. He's really thoughtful. He's thinking through, how should our worship services reflect the shape of the gospel? How are they gathered around the word? How is the word saturating everything we do, from the elements to the form? And so he's thinking through those things already as a young man. So he'll be a treasure to a local church, perhaps
That's a
even
really good
yeah.
word.
Yeah.
Investing in the younger generation.
Yeah.
And I would piggyback off that with this. I went through a phase where I thought, okay, the church's mission, the church's primary mission is not so much music education as it is worship. So I went through this phase. I'm grateful that it was somewhat of a short phase, because I began to realize very, very quickly, as you said, public schools, colleges and universities beginning more and more and more to dump the arts. It really is an opportunity for us in the local church. And I do think, I'm really praying that there's going to be a pendulum swing that begins to really begin to invest more and more in children's choirs and youth choirs and ministry choir and really strong music education within the church that's fostered that's fostered so that children have an opportunity to grow and develop that area, but that has a really strong theological foundation with it as well. We combine that, and I think we're going to see churches that are going to start raising their own, and that's what we need to do. I think that's going to be a huge aspect of it. So as we think through that, as we even think through our curriculum, a developmental side of this, of making sure that, because I'm seeing it, I think more and more churches are realizing, boy, we jettisoned all that. Who's here to do it now? Nobody. Well, we better figure out how to do that.
That's really good. What both of you are evidencing is that it's not happening in the schools anymore. We used to be able to rely on the schools. The
That's right.
church has got to step in.
That's right.
And do that. Invest in the younger generation.
That's
and
right.
you mentioned in an interview we did last spring the idea of choirs being a tool to help congregational singing. It doesn't
Yes.
replace congregational singing.
That's right.
But invest in children's choirs, invest in youth choirs and adult choirs, because that's going to fuel what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Because it's not happening in the schools anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Real quickly, so Dr. Burgraff is watching the live stream. So hi, Dr. Burgraff. He commented in some suggestions for dissertation, so I'll just tell you real quickly what he said. He said, find a topic you're willing to research and study for 5 years of your life, because if you don't find something that you really enjoy, you're going to totally burn out, which is a really good piece of advice.
It is.
You got to find something you're interested in. And then he mentioned, when you read an article or book or website related to your topic, even now during grad work, create a Word document, write down some quotes, file it somewhere. I'm an Evernote junkie. Use Evernote. Use some sort of organizational system where you can save stuff for later. So that you've got reference to it in a later time. That's really, really good. So I'm gonna give you all a question to be thinking about, because I know it's one you want to think about, and then I'll actually ask a different question, but just to give you a forewarning. What was your most challenging moment in ministry or academia? So that's coming, just to give you a forecast. Caleb Barrett, one of our MM grads who now serves in Hawaii, real sacrifice. He just questioned in here, how, as a music worship pastor, what are ways to help a church body heal from trials, whether it be COVID or pastoral abuse, or what are ways that we can minister to the people in our congregations? I mean, this is just an illustration. We're not just doing music, and we're not just doing the Sunday morning service. We're again, maybe depending on the role or the title, but most often we're pastors. How do we help to minister to a congregation that has really suffered through something? Any words of wisdom or advice there?
Dr. Lott, I'd be really interested in hearing what you would say about that. Do you mind me putting you on the spot?
Sure. Well, just as an example from my experience, my home church, my little home church that nurtured me, split in 1976 when I was in college, but that's another story. And I was actually kicked out of a church. I don't know if that would disbar me from being on seminary faculty. But
No, it's
to
okay.
get serious, I think the most important thing is that you have to acknowledge it, and it has to be part of, you know, the community experience that so many times Sunday morning we're painting this picture that everything is perfect and all the music is peppy and happy, and though I think it's not quite as extreme as it used to be, but you know, we don't sing songs of lament. And how many laments are there in the Psalms? Dr.
We just talked about that yesterday.
Daniel could tell you that, and that is part of, you know, just life in a sinful world, in a fallen world, and to pretend like everything is okay when even on a regular Sunday there's someone out there who's hurting, and we need to acknowledge that. And when the whole church is hurting, it has to be addressed either through music or maybe some special events, bringing in, you know, a counselor or someone. I mean, if it's really like pastoral abuse or something, then that really has to be addressed very seriously and intentionally.
It seems like there's got to be space for it, and sometimes we don't want the space for it. I think that I go back to Braden's colloquium. Was it just last or 2 weeks ago? Sure, when he was talking about confession. I think there's a similar space for this as well. It's a similar space for lament. It's a similar space for grief. It's a similar space that we need to be able to facilitate for our people, where they have. I'll never forget the night we exercised church discipline on a gentleman, an older gentleman, who we had tried for months in that area, and he told. So it was the night that the church gathered to vote him out, and it was grief. I mean, our pastor wept, and the guy had been most horrible to our pastor, but our pastor stood in front and just wept, and I thought, okay, here's a guy that's been pummeled by this gentleman, and he's weeping, but he was weeping over the realization that we are literally putting him out of the body, and it was a time for our church to weep corporately and to grieve corporately, and you've got to have the space for it. We've got to remember that worship is not meant to transcend our problems. We don't step into worship to get away from reality. We step into worship to step into reality, and we don't check our problems at the door. And I don't think David does that in the Psalms,
Right.
And I don't think we're supposed to do that in worship either. And we step into worship to have the transcendent God meet us and minister to us and call out to Him for our needs.
It is such an important lesson from the Psalms that we've talked about in the Psalms class. It's not just always praise, happy. That's the goal, but because of the reality of sin in the world and our own flesh, it is getting to the praise through the lament.
Amen.
And that's what we're
Amen.
going to do. Yeah, good. Okay, I'm going to get to that final question of the most challenging issue. I want to open it up. Any follow-up thoughts or questions? Dr. Lewis.
Hey, I'm having a mask malfunction. Sorry, I've been searching the building for you. We finally found it.
Come on in, brother. I'm going to pull this chair over here.
Sure, yeah.
I'm gonna ask the most challenging experience in ministry here in a moment. I wanted to open it up. Any questions from anyone else here as we move towards the close here? Any follow-ups or additional questions? I know a lot of you submitted some things, so just want to make sure that give you an opportunity. Anybody online here? Looks good. Okay, great. So the final question is, and we can go through all of us. That we got about 8 minutes here. Most challenging experience in either ministry or academia that you faced, and maybe a brief word on how you dealt with it.
Can I go first since I have to get back?
So you're going to
choir
get back.
rehearsal?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Goodness. Besides the camel falling over, which if you don't know that story, you can just YouTube Camel in West Palm Beach, and you'll see it. Oh, you guys aren't wearing masks. Great. Well, I'll take it off.
We're sufficiently distanced, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
A couple things. One is leading a church through a 5-year interim of no senior pastor. which was incredibly difficult. Great the first year because I could do whatever I wanted to do.
The cat's away.
Yeah. But year number 2, 3, 4, and 5 were really hard. And you just want to bail. You just want to say, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like this. The budgets are tanking. The attendance is tanking. The people without a senior leader, they are incredibly nitpicky at that moment. Every little thing becomes a big thing. And it was just really hard to do. And yet, I just felt compelled by the Lord that no matter how hard this was, I need to stick it out. Because you begin thinking, I don't need this, I can go anywhere else I want to go.
Probably had offers to do that.
You know what? Just those kinds of temptations will be in your face during that time.
Yep.
And you just have to listen to the Lord. And the Lord calls us to imperfect places, to work with imperfect people, and to serve imperfect churches during times that sometimes are just amazingly wonderful and sometimes that are incredibly difficult. And the second thing, I'll share this and then I'll take off back to the other side of the campus. But I had our pastor one time say this to me. It was really hard. He said, Chuck, you do not have the gift of reading scripture in service, so I don't want you to do it anymore. So what do? Well, you honor the Lord by honoring your authority. And you say, yes, sir. And so I didn't read scripture anymore. However, every interlude that I possibly could, scripture came up on the screen. You know? I was blown away. I was shocked. I was dismayed. I was disheartened. I wanted to quit. I wanted to leave. But I needed to honor my authority, even though I thought he was totally wrong. And that pastor came out of the kind of the mindset of pastors. I would say pastors in the 80s, 90s, somewhere in that area, that music guys sing, preachers preach. You, music guy, don't talk. Just get the people singing. That's all I want you to do. And thankfully, by somewhere in the 2000s, my new pastor, Pastor Jimmy, came on. And I was used to not saying hardly anything just because of that. And I asked Pastor Jimmy, I'm like, I'm happy to not say anything if that's what you prefer. And he's like, are you kidding? He's like, you're a pastor just as much as I am. You say whatever the Lord puts on your heart.
Wow.
So it was a different day.
That's the kind of pastor to look for.
That
Yep.
is.
Yep.
That is the kind of pastor to look for, but that is not always the pastor that God's going to call you to serve.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, you'll get the opportunity at some point over the next 20, 30, 40 years to serve with a pastor like that. But you may not, because God calls you as an imperfect person to work with imperfect pastors
Yeah.
in imperfect churches.
It's good.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
for
dropping
letting
in,
me
Dr.
just
Lewis.
stop
Good
here.
to see you.
And on that note,
Yeah.
I think I'll just stop.
Okay,
here.
good. Great.
That's like-
Thanks so
See
much.
ya.
See you later. Good. I'll go real quickly next. We've got about 3 minutes, so we can maybe breeze through some. And I was glad we were able to get Dr. Lewis to give him a little time there.
Yep.
Mine is actually the complete opposite of his first, and that is the time that I actually candidated at a church, went in view of a call, preached, worked with a choir, was there a whole weekend, and then didn't get the vote. They had their bylaws required 80%, and I think I got 79 or something like that. And talk about hard. The pastor told me later it revealed actually some fissures in the church that he and the deacons didn't know about. But it's hard when you're set to go somewhere and God says no, right? But I look back at that now, man, I dodged a bullet in some ways.
Yes.
I would not be here today if that had not happened.
Yes.
It is hard in the moment, but we've
Yes.
got to trust in the sovereign plan of the Lord.
Yes, it's good.
Other challenges you've all faced?
By the way, I was going in view of a call as interim one time, and I got a 74%, and I needed 75. This is for interim, and the vote was like 2 weeks after I was there. So who even knows who was voting? But to say dodge a bullet, like all the pastors within 3 months left, the church split. So Likewise, I dodged a bullet. Now, that wasn't so challenging for me. It was just interim.
Yeah.
I was at a different church the following Sunday. But I think the most challenging thing for me has not necessarily been something personal with me, but was just something that really affected our local body. And we had, some of the details are still really private, but we had an issue of immorality with a staff member. And that was really challenging for us. And we all just took the approach of, by the way, that ended up, we tried to go through Matthew 18 and lead towards, even though he had disqualified himself immediately from ministry, we still wanted him to repent and be part of the body. But things kept coming to light, and we just ended up having to dismiss him from membership. But through that, it took a toll on our church. He was beloved, and we had to, the shepherding the church was really challenging. And as they hurt, we as pastors were hurting as well. So
That's good.
Dr. Lott.
Well, speaking of, a split church, as I said, I made light of it, but it was the most horrible thing when my home church split, because this was a small community, and the people who had loved me as a kid growing up, a pastor had come in, and it was a power struggle between the pastor and deacons. We were meeting, trying to fix things, and the pastor did not want it to be fixed. And so some of us just left, and then they voted us out. And then within a year or two, he was gone, and that's been 44 years, and there are two churches in this little town that are both pitiful. And 20 years later, the new church was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. And I thought, okay, I can see a sign from God. I called the area missionary and said, you need to go in there and tell these people it's time to come back together. But and he wouldn't do that. But it was the fact that these little old ladies voted me and my family out because the pastor told them to.
You just remain faithful, and
God's sovereign.
Dr. Kreider.
I would say but there's several. After doing this for 30 years, there are several things. But the one that popped into the mind was the person who showed up to church and was dressed as a woman, and we thought she was fine and nice lady. Got her connected to a room with one of our other female single women about the same age, and several weeks later found out she wasn't a woman. She was a guy, and I had hours and hours of conversations with so many people involved in that situation. Finally, this person left, but had a family, wife and kids. It was crazy. But praise the Lord, this guy was actually healed and began a ministry to people in this area. And part of it, what he mentioned was the time we were willing to spend, because you get something like that and you want to go. You're out, get out of here. We don't ever, but you know what? Sin is sin, and you can't pick who you're going to love and who you're not.
That's good.
And that was a tough one.
Well, that's a good topic to end with, because ministry is not all roses and joy. There are struggles, but the Lord always sustains us, and the ministry is a joy when we have the proper perspective, when our goal is to serve the Lord, to remain faithful, and to serve His people. And so it connects with the earlier question. We have to acknowledge there is sin. We have to acknowledge there are challenges. But when we do that, we can go through that with the Lord's help and come out the other side fully joyful and praising Him for the wonderful things that He has done that we didn't even expect. So that's all.
May I add one real quick thing? I hope you all know that any of us in the faculty, whether that be Dr. Burgraff or Dr. Caston, Dr. Lewis. Dr. Caston obviously is the worship pastor at Gambrill. If you have situations you need to talk about or questions that you have, any of us individually, and you know what, you can get a hold of Laramie.
Yep. Fellow student,
you can get a hold of Laramie. We trust him, and he's been in the minute. We are here for you. You're not here for us. We're here for you, and we want to serve you and help you in any way.
And after graduation too, I still get calls from previous students. Hey, I'm facing this situation. What do you think we should do? So.
Amen.
All right, thank